The galaxy had a way of deciding what mattered and what did not. It had been doing this for thousands of years, long before humans ever looked up at the stars and wondered if something was. Looking back, the strong planets kept their seats at the table, the weak ones became footnotes in someone else's history. That was simply how things worked. Nobody wrote that rule down anywhere. Nobody needed to. Every civilization that survived long enough figured it out on its own. The galactic concord was the closest thing the known galaxy had to a government. It was made up of 47 spacefaring civilizations, each one with its own history, its own fleet, its own agenda. They met in a great hall on the neutral station called Arvith Prime, a city-sized structure floating in the empty space between three star systems. The hall was enormous. The seats went up in wide rings like an amphitheater, built for giants. Delegates from dozens of worlds sat in those seats, each wearing their colors, breathing their filtered air, watching each other with a particular kind of patience that comes from knowing that every word spoken in that room could mean war or trade or silence for 100 years. Earth had been given a seat at the outer ring, the provisional ring, the ring where new members sat until the conquered decided they were worth something more permanent. It was not an insult. Exactly, it was just the way things were arranged. Old members sat close to the center. New ones sat at the edge and watched and learned. Humanity had been a provisional member for 6 years, long enough to know the rules, not long enough to change them. Ambassador Yara, she represented Earth. At the Concord, she was a tall woman with short gray hair and eyes that rarely showed what she was thinking. She had spent 30 years in diplomacy before this posting, and in it she had learned the most important skill in that work: how to sit still and listen while someone was doing something that they thought you didn't understand. She was very good at that. On the morning that would later be called the turning point, she sat in her seat in the outer ring and watched the Vorath delegation walk to the floor. The Vorath were reptilian. They stood on 2 legs, but their bodies were wide and low, their necks thick, their eyes set wide apart on angular heads. Oh, they moved with a kind of deliberate heaviness, like each step was a small statement of intent. They came from the Vorath Dominion, a stretch of space covering 11 systems in the galactic East, built entirely through conquest. They had absorbed 4 civilizations in the last 2 centuries. 2 of those civilizations no longer existed in any meaningful form. High Marshal Kitsara did not attend the Concord meetings himself. He sent his ambassador, a Vorath named Drex, and I, who was polished enough to say terrible things in very clean language. Drex was good at his work. He wore formal Dominion colors, deep black, with gold markings along the collar, and he spoke in the measured tones of someone who had already decided how the conversation would end. Drex stood at the center floor and requested a formal review of Earth's membership classification. The room shifted, not visibly, not in any way that would show up on a recording, but Yara felt it. The slight tightening in the way certain delegates held themselves, the careful blankness on the faces of the Keth delegation who sat in the inner ring and whose trade ships used the same corridors as Earth's. The small, almost bored tilt of the head from the Solari representative, who was old enough to have watched 4 civilizations lose their standing in this room. Drex laid out his case with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed it many times. Earth, he said, Anna was a provisional member in name, but a liability in practice. The Sol system sat at the intersection of three major trade lanes: the Keth Corridor, the Drev Passage, and the Outer Reach Route. Lanes that carried rare elements, shipments worth more than most small planets could generate in a decade. System that important, Drex argued, required a protector, a guardian, something with teeth. Then he showed the scanned data, and it had been gathered by a Voreth deep rain survey vessel 3 months earlier under the cover of routine astronomical research. The data was clean and thorough, and it showed exactly what it showed. The Sol system's defenses were by any galactic standard almost non-existent. One orbital defense platform above Earth, aging in, lightly armed, a small fleet of 7 frigates, short range, clearly designed for patrol rather than combat. No dreadnoughts, no battleships, no deep space fortifications beyond the single platform. Drex let the data sit on the room's display screens for a long moment before he spoke again. He said that under Article 12 of the Concord Charter, a member world that could not demonstrate adequate self-defense capability could be reclassified as a non-militarized dependency. A dependency had no veto rights. Dependency could not refuse the protective oversight of a more capable member. A dependency was, for all practical purposes, Mike available. He did not say the word available out loud. He didn't need to. Yara watched the room. She watched the Keth delegate study the table in front of him. She watched the Sulari representative make a small note on his data pad. She watched 3 different inner ring delegates exchange glances that were just a fraction too quick to be casual. She noted all of it with the careful attention of someone filing things away for later use. Then Drex said something that made the whole room very quiet. He said that the Voreth Dominion, as a senior member of the Concord with Deep Space Patrol capabilities, was prepared to offer Earth its protection, out of respect for the Concord's values, out of concern for the stability of those 3 critical trade lanes, out of simple neighborly goodwill. Several delegates coughed. One of them might have been hiding a laugh. Yara stood up. She did not ask for the floor, and she did not wait for the moderator to recognize her. She simply stood, and the room looked at her, and she spoke in the calm voice of someone who was not surprised by any of this and had not been for quite some time. She said that Earth thanked the Voreth Dominion for its concern. She said that Earth's delegation would review the proposal according to standard Concord procedure, which allowed 30 days for a formal response. She said this without emotion, without heat, without anything that could be described as alarm. She sat back down. Drex looked at her for a moment, then he nodded and returned to his seat. The session ended. Delegates filed out through their respective corridors. Yara walked at an even pace to the Earth delegation's private suite, a modest set of rooms in the outer spoke of Arvith Prime. Her aide, a young man named Tomas, who was efficient and smart and still young enough to show his feelings on his face, fell into step beside her, and he looked shaken. She did not. He asked her what they were going to do. She told him to send a message to Earth. Priority encrypted, full compression. Flagged for the office of the secretary. General and the Joint Chiefs. Simultaneously, he asked her what the message should say. She thought for a moment, then she told him the message should contain exactly 4 words. They've made their move. Tomas sent the message. He did it without fully understanding it. He was new enough to diplomacy that he still thought a message should explain something. He did not yet understand that sometimes 4 words were enough, that sometimes the person on the other end of the line had been waiting for exactly those 4 words for years, 38 light-years away. The Vorath Dominion's war city of Kith'Dara. High Marshal Kitsara read his ambassador's report and was satisfied. Kitsara was old by Vorath standards. His scales had gone from green-brown to a deep gray at the edges, and the ridge above his eyes had thickened with age into something that made him look permanently angry. He had commanded fleets for 50 years. He had taken 2 systems by force, one by negotiation backed by the credible threat of force, and one by simply arriving with enough ships that the other side decided thinking about it further was not worth the trouble. And he understood power the way Surgeon understood the body, not as something to be admired, but as something to be used correctly at the right moment with the right pressure. He read the scan data again. He had read it 4 times before this. It did not change. 1 orbital platform, 7 frigates, no deep space capability worth the name. His analysts had cross-referenced the data against 3 independent surveys, and the Concord's own publicly filed records. Humans had been in space for less than a century. They had achieved faster than light travel only 40 years ago. Barely enough time to establish a handful of colony ships, let alone a war fleet. Their industrial base was significant, his analysts noted, but entirely civilian-focused: energy production, food systems, colonial infrastructure. Not warships. Worse, one of his younger staff officers had flagged something in the report, a note suggesting that Earth's ocean floors contained unusual thermal readings that might indicate underground construction. The note was attached as an addendum. Kitsara had read it then. He had moved on. Thermal readings in ocean floors could mean 100 things: geological activity, tidal energy harvesting, underwater habitat construction. There was no evidence of weapons-grade manufacturing, no evidence of anything that changed what the scan data clearly showed. He called his war council. There were 7 of them, the senior commanders of the Vorath Dominion's military apparatus. They sat around a long table of dark stone in a room with no windows, because Ketsera had always found windows in command rooms to be a distraction. He laid out the situation without drama. He showed them the data. He showed them the trade lanes. He showed them Earth's position at the intersection of all 3. He told them what he intended to do. The council approved it unanimously. It took less than 20 minutes. Ketsera assembled a fleet, 200 warships, not everything the Dominion had. That would have been wasteful. 200 was more than enough to handle 7 frigates and 1 old platform. He picked his best captains, not because he expected a real fight, but because sloppy work against a weak opponent was still sloppy work. He had standards. The fleet would travel to Sol. It would arrive with weapons active. It would transmit a formal demand for Earth's surrender of military oversight. Earth would comply because Earth had Nothing to fight back with, and because humans were, in his experience, rational enough to understand mathematics, 200 warships against 7 frigates was not a battle. It was an announcement Ketzera gave. The order to depart in 72 hours. Back on Arvith Prime, things Clear's throat moved the way they always moved in places where many civilizations live close together and nobody fully trusted anyone else. Slowly. On the surface, quickly underneath. In the public corridors, the Concords. Business continued as normal. Delegates attended committee sessions. Trade agreements were reviewed. 3 minor border disputes were discussed and tabled for further study. On the floor of the main hall, with the Article 12 motion regarding Earth sat in the queue for formal debate as procedure required. In the private rooms behind closed doors, and in the kind of conversations that were never recorded, other things were said. The Keth delegate, a cautious being named Vorev, who had represented his people for 20 years, spoke quietly with 2 other inner ring delegates over a meal. He said nothing directly. He asked questions, and he asked whether anyone had verified Earth's defense data independently. He asked whether the Article 12 motion had the support needed to pass. He asked whether anyone had told the humans informally that the motion was coming as a courtesy. Both other delegates looked at their food. Vorev understood. He nodded. Slowly, he said nothing more about it. On the other side of the station, in a quarter not often used, the Sulari representative walked alone at an unhurried pace. He was very old even for his species, and he had seen things in his long career that most people that station had only read about. He had been present when the Dreven collective lost its membership status. He had been in the room when the Marika agreed to Vorev oversight and ceased to exist as an independent civilization. 8 years later, he stopped walking for a moment and looked out through a viewport at the stars. He thought about the human ambassador, about her stillness, about the 4 words she had sent home. He had not intercepted the message, but he had worked in the station long enough to know when someone was sending a signal rather than asking for help. He had seen panic in this hall many times. He knew what it looked like. Human woman had not shown a single trace of it. He found that interesting. He also found it slightly worrying how, in the way that very experienced people sometimes worry, not about the thing that is obviously dangerous, but about the thing that is too calm when it should be afraid. He began walking again. He had a meeting to attend. Life went on as it always did at the edge of large events. On Earth, the message arrived in the early hours of the morning, local time in Geneva, where the Secretary General's office was located. It was decoded in seconds and delivered to 2 people simultaneously. The Secretary General herself and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man named Admiral Eric Vance, who had been in the military for 40 years and who had spent the last 15 of those years preparing for exactly this moment. Vance read the 4 words on his secure screen. He sat with them for a moment. Then he picked up a different device, one that was not connected to any public network or that had no transmission record anywhere on Earth's open communications grid, and made a call. The call was short. He said 3 words: initiate observation. Protocol, that was all. He put the device down. He looked out the window of his office At the city below, quiet in the early morning, lights reflecting on the wet streets, he thought about the 200 warships that were almost certainly being loaded and fueled in a war dock somewhere across the galaxy, and he thought about what their commanders believed they would find when they arrived at Sol. A small, sad smile crossed his face. He thought about all the years of quiet work, all the decisions made in rooms smaller than this one, by people who understood something that the rest of the galaxy had not figured out yet. He thought about the cold dark of the asteroid belt and what was sitting there in the silence waiting. He hoped the Vor had good doctors. They were going to need them. And GT snorts. And GT. He went back to his desk. There was a great deal to do and not much time to do it. Outside the window, the city went on, sleeping, perfectly ordinary, perfectly peaceful, having no idea that somewhere in the galaxy a fleet of 200 warships had just set course for home, having no idea that home was ready. The Pacific Ocean had always kept secrets. It was the largest body of water on Earth, deeper in places than the tallest mountains were tall, and my yard darker at the bottom than anywhere else on the surface of the planet. Humans had explored it for centuries and still had not fully mapped it. Strange creatures lived in its deepest parts, things that had no need for light and had evolved entirely in pressure and cold and silence. The ocean did not give up what it held. Without a fight, it had been hiding something for 37 years. To Commander Dara Voss stood on the upper observation deck of a transport shuttle as it descended through 3,000 m of black water. She was looking out through the reinforced viewport, watching the lights of the facility appear below her like city coming out of a fog. She had made this descent over 100 times. In her career, it never got ordinary. The bastion yard stretched across the floor of the Pacific in a complex that covered more ground than some small countries. It had been built in the sections over decades, each section added carefully and quietly and covered by the kind of bureaucratic paperwork that made things disappear into filing systems and stay there. The construction crews had signed agreements that were not quite official, secrets acts and not quite employment contracts, but were both at the same time. They had built something enormous in the dark and then gone home and said nothing, because they understood what they were building and why it needed to stay quiet. The yards could build a dreadnought from keel to launch in 14 months. It had done so 11 times. Voss stepped off the shuttle into the main receiving bay, a chamber large enough to land a fleet of aircraft, and was met by her second in command, compact and serious man named Lieutenant Commander Ren Park, who handed her status tablet without being asked and fell into step beside her, and the tablet showed everything she needed to know in a quick summary. Activation order received 41 minutes ago. Stage 1 protocols already running. Power systems coming online in sequence. Crew recall underway through the standard cover signals. A series of apparently random commercial broadcasts that to the right people, listening on the right frequencies, spelled out very specific instructions. She asked Ren how long before the belt contingent was ready. He said 36 hours. If everything went smoothly. She asked what was most likely to not go smoothly. He said the reactor on the UEFS Titan's Wrath had been running cold for the last cycle, and the engineers were cautiously optimistic about bringing it to full power on schedule, which in his experience meant they were not optimistic at all. She told him to put their best team on it. She walked through the yards while Wren briefed her. Past dry docks were smaller. Vessels were being fueled and loaded. Must past engineering bays where the hum of work was already rising to something that felt more like a vibration in the bones than a sound in the ears. Workers moved with purpose. Nobody ran. Running in a facility like this was how accidents happened, but everyone moved as if the floor beneath them was slightly tilted in the direction they needed to go. Voss had been in the military for 22 years. She had served on 3 different vessels and had commanded a destroyer for 4 years before being moved into the strategic command structure, and had spent the last 6 years as the operational commander of what the yards called the surface layer, the visible part of Earth's defense, the 7 frigates and the orbital platform that the galaxy could see and measure, and apparently dismiss. She had never told anyone what she actually commanded, not at parties, not to family, not to anyone who didn't already know. Why? Because anyone who already knew understood why you didn't talk about it. She thought about the Vorath scan data, which had been quietly intercepted and copied months before it was ever presented to the conquered. She thought about the analyst reports she had read, carefully detailing how thoroughly and confidently the Vorath had concluded that Earth was defenseless. She thought about the small note in one of those reports. A junior Vorath staff officer had flagged the thermal readings from Earth's ocean floors as potentially significant. The note had been reviewed by a senior officer and deprioritized. She had read that note 3 times. She was grateful for confident enemies 52 million kilometers away in the outer stretch of the asteroid belt. 14 ships were waking up. They had been out there for a long time. The oldest of them, the UEFS Sovereignty, had been cold, drifting in the belt for 19 years, her power systems reduced to the absolute minimum needed to keep the internal systems from dying entirely. Her crew replaced on rotating 6-month tour by people who traveled to and from her in small unmarked transport vessels that moved without transponder signals. The newer ones had been out there for less time, but all of them had been waiting long enough that the crews who served on them thought of the waiting as simply the nature of the job. They were dreadnoughts. The word did not fully communicate what they were, because words are built by the experience of the people using them, and no one in the galaxy had seen anything quite like these. Each one was between 3 and 12 and 5 km long. They were not elegant ships. They were not built to be. They were built the way a hammer is built, for what they did, not for how they looked. Their hulls were dark and layered, made of materials developed over 30 years of research into what happened when things tried very hard to destroy something and failed. Their weapon systems included mass drivers capable of accelerating a dense metal slug to a significant fraction of the speed of light, close-range energy weapons for work at short distances, Shinar and missile banks that could put enough warheads into space to fill a small sky. Their point defense systems were perhaps the most remarkable thing about them. Each dreadnought was surrounded, when active, by a network of smaller automated weapons platforms that tracked and destroyed incoming projectiles with a speed and accuracy that made the space around the ship almost impossible to penetrate. When the network was designed and then redesigned and then redesigned again by teams of engineers who had spent their careers thinking about what someone would try to do to one of these ships and then making sure it wouldn't work. The Dreadnoughts also had something that no other military force in the known galaxy had yet developed into practical application: genuinely effective artificial intelligence targeting systems, not the limited automated systems that most species used, which could handle simple tracking tasks but needed crew oversight for anything complex. These were systems that could manage an entire battle engagement without a human giving them individual instructions, that could assess a changing field of hundreds of targets simultaneously and make decisions in fractions of a second that would have taken a human crew several seconds at minimum. Humans had been good at computing for a long time. It turned out that computing, it scaled up and applied to the problem of how to destroy things very quickly and very accurately, was extremely useful. The first sign of life on the Dreadnoughts was light, not the dramatic blaze of a full power on, but the slow creep of illumination through darkened corridors as system after system came back from standby. Internal lights, then environmental controls, then communications grids, then deepest in each ship's engineering section, and up the first low vibration of a reactor beginning to warm from cold sleep to operational temperature. A crew member on the UEFS Indomitable, young woman named Specialist Ashade, who was on her first posting to the belt contingent and had not entirely stopped being surprised by the size of the ship she lived on, was in the engineering monitoring bay when the main reactor began its startup sequence. She had been told this would happen. She had read the protocols. She had done the training simulations. She had not been prepared for what it felt like. The reactor coming to full power was not a noise, it was a change in everything. The floor under her feet went from still to subtly constantly alive. The air in the bay changed pressure slightly. Every screen in the room shifted from standby amber to operational white, and through the hull, through 3M of layered composite armor that could absorb a direct hit from most warship weapon systems. She felt the hum of something enormous deciding to be awake. She sat very still for a moment, then she ran her checks and filed her report, because that was her job, and the ship needed her to do her job. Commander Voss received the belt activation confirmation at the 12-hour mark. She was in the command center of the Bastion yards by then, standing in front of the primary tactical display, a three-dimensional holographic map of the Sol system that covered most of a large room, with each tracked object represented by a small light and a data tag. The asteroid belt on the display looked the same as it always did from outside, a scattered field of rocks and dust and debris, the chaotic remnant of something that had tried to become a planet and never quite managed it. Oh, but when she filtered the display to show the deep ping returns of the yard's own long-range sensors, other things appeared in the belt, 14 things, each one large and geometrically regular, each one now showing the faint but unmistakable power signature of a reactor running warm. They looked like small suns being born. In slow motion, Voss stood with her hands clasped behind her back and watched the lights come on, Ren came to stand beside her. He looked at the display. He said nothing for a moment, then he said that the Vorth were estimated to arrive at the edge of the Sol system in approximately 70 hours. She nodded. He asked her, and there was something in the way he asked, something quieter than his usual professional tone, whether she thought this was really going to work. Not the battle exactly, the whole thing. The plan that had been running for 37 years, that had been built by dozens of people who mostly hadn't lived to see it come to this point. She thought about the question. Seriously, she did not dismiss it. Ren was not asking out of doubt. He had none. She knew that about him. But out of the kind of honest wonder that comes from standing at the edge of something that was supposed to be theoretical and discovering it has become real. She said yes. She said it was going to work because it was designed by people who understood the first and most important thing about fighting from a position of apparent weakness, that the enemy's confidence is your most powerful weapon. The Vorth were coming because they believed the math, 200 against 7. They had calculated the outcome before they ever left their home dock. They were not coming to fight, they were coming to arrive, and when you believe you're arriving rather than fighting, well, you don't bring your best thinking, you bring your paperwork. She looked at the 14 lights in the belt. She said that she wasn't afraid, not even a little. In the dark side of the moon, in the facility called Fort Silence, the lights had been on for hours. Fort Silence was not a dramatic name, but it was an accurate one. The facility had been built into the lunar rock over 20 years, carved out with the same patient secrecy that had produced the bastion yards, and it had earned its name because not a single signal had ever escaped it that was not intended to escape. It was shielded, buried, cold from the outside, undetectable by any scan the galaxy had yet developed. It was the brain of Earth's actual military apparatus, and it had been thinking for a very long time. Admiral Haruto Shen arrived at Fort Silence via a sublunar transit tunnel from the near side landing facility. He was 61 years old, lean and gray-haired, but with the kind of posture that never fully relaxed even in quiet rooms. He had commanded the belt contingent for 7 years. Before that, he had been the chief strategic architect of something called the Iron Doctrine, Earth's actual military strategy, developed over decades, known in its complete form to fewer than 200 people alive. He walked into the main command room of Fort Silence and looked at the screens. There were a great many screens on it. They showed him everything: the Vorath fleet's projected course, updated from the passive sensor network scattered across the outer solar system, the current status of the 14 Dreadnoughts in the belt, the readiness reports from the bastion yards, the tactical display of the solar system with every rock and corridor and calculated firing angle already mapped and modeled again. He took a cup of coffee from the station near the door and stood in front of the main display, looking at the galaxy the way a chess player looks at a board when they have been thinking 10 moves ahead for 37 years, and the other player has finally made the move that the whole game was waiting for. A young officer asked him if he needed anything. He said no. He asked her if the fleet was on schedule. She said, "Yes, sir. All 14 confirmed warm and cruise at 70% manning with full Complement expected in 20 hours. He nodded. He drank his coffee. He thought about the 200 Vorlag ships out there in FTL space, moving at speed toward a system they believed was sleeping. He thought about their captains reading their own screens, running their own calculations, confident in the math of overwhelming force. He thought about what they were expecting to find. He thought about what they were actually going to find. He set down his cup. He said quietly, and to no one in particular, that it was a long time coming. Then he got to work. The edge of the Sol system was not a line. There was no wall, no marker, no clear boundary where one thing ended and another began. Space did not work that way, but humans had decided some years ago that the edge of their system began at the outer boundary of the Uit cloud, that vast and distant shell of frozen objects that drifted at the very limit of the sun's gravitational reach, so far out that the sun itself was just the brightest star in the sky rather than the thing that ran the world. They had put sensors out there, passive ones, cold and quiet, and built into the faces of rocks that looked like every other rock in the cloud. The sensors had been sitting out there for 19 years listening, and they had never had anything important to report until now. The first contact alert reached Fort Silence at exactly 14 minutes past 3:00 in the morning in Greenwich Mean Time, which was the time zone the facility used because someone had decided years ago that a unified clock made coordination easier, and nobody had bothered to argue. The alert was not a sound or a light. It was a small entry on a screen in the passive sensor monitoring room, a room staffed at all hours by 3 analysts whose job was to watch those screens and report anything that was not background noise. When analyst second class Priya Mehta was one of the 3 on duty when the entry appeared. She looked at it. She looked at it again. She ran the verification protocol, which took 40 seconds, and confirmed what she was seeing. Then she pressed the alert key and reported it up the chain in the clipped, factual language that her training required. The Voreth fleet had dropped out of FTL travel at the outer edge of the Uit cloud. Preliminary contact count 193 vessels. Shoe approximate bearing inner system, direct course toward Sol. Speed standard sublight approach, likely reducing to tactical speed in approximately 6 to 8 hours. She filed the report and went back to watching her screens because that was her job, and the rest of it was someone else's job. And the system worked because everyone did their part. Admiral Shen was awake when the alert came. He had not slept in the previous cycle, not fully. He had dozed for a few hours in the chair in his office, which was not sleep in any medical sense, but was the kind of rest that experienced military people learned to take when full sleep was a luxury the schedule did not offer. When his communications officer knocked and entered and told him contact had been confirmed, he was already sitting up. He walked to the main command room with his coffee, a fresh one this time, and stood in front of the display, which had updated itself in the seconds since the alert to show the Voreth fleet as a cluster of red contact markers at the far edge of the system. From that distance, against the scale of the Sol system map, the 200 enemy ships looked like a small smear of color. He knew better than to be comforted by that. Commander Voss came online from the bastion yards within minutes, her image appeared on the secondary screen beside the main display. She was slightly lower resolution from the relay through the deep water, but her voice was clear. She reported that all 14 dreadnoughts were fully crewed and fully powered, that the fleet was in position in the belts and awaiting orders, and that the Titan's Wrath reactor issue had been resolved 40 minutes before contact. An engineer named Kowalski had apparently worked through 2 consecutive rest periods to make it happen. Voss said she intended to give Kowalski a very long leave when this was over. Shen said that sounded reasonable. He asked for the full tactical breakdown. The next 2 hours were work, detailed, technical focused work, the kind that doesn't make good stories but is the reason good stories happen. The tactical team's modeled approach vectors. They ran probability assessment on the Vorth formation options based on the fleet composition the sensors were now clearly identifying, so they confirmed the positioning of the Hephaestus array, the mass driver network built into selected asteroids throughout the belt, each one aimed and calibrated and ready, part of the Sol system's terrain itself rather than something the enemy could see coming. They checked the point defense network, cross-checked the communications relay to Fort Silence, confirmed the response protocols with the captains of every dreadnought through the encrypted command channel. All 14 confirmed ready. At hour 6, when the Vorth fleet had reduced to tactical approach speed and was moving through the deep outer system at a pace that suggested they were running active scans, checking the system as they came, not bothering to hide themselves, because why would they need to? Shen made his decision about timing. He would not wait for them to reach the asteroid belt. He would not wait for them to reach Jupiter's orbit or Mars or any other landmark. He would speak to them when they reached the point he had long ago designated on his maps as the threshold, a specific distance from the inner system beyond which retreat was possible but significantly harder. He wanted them past the threshold when he spoke. He wanted them committed. He also had another reason. He had been thinking about it for most of the night. He was about to say something to a Vorth marshal on an open channel that the entire Concord would be monitoring. He did not want his words to be those of a man defending a door. He wanted them to be those of a man standing in the middle of a room he owned. There was a difference. The galaxy needed to understand that difference. At the Concord station of Arvith Prime, the night cycle was several hours advanced, and most of the diplomatic staff were asleep or in their private quarters, but the Concord's automated monitoring systems never slept. And when a contact array of 193 Vorth warships appeared in Sol system space, the system flagged it, and the duty officers were woken and the lights in certain key rooms came back on. The Concord did not interfere in military matters between members and non-members under most circumstances. Article 17 was clear about that, but 200 warships entering a member system, even a provisional one, was not an ordinary circumstance, as in the duty staff had authority to open the monitoring feeds and watch. So the Concord watched in a secure communications room. An analyst named Kale, who worked for the Keth delegation and was up late for reasons of personal habit, noticed the feeds open and began following the data. He sent a quick message to Delegate Voriv. Sol contact confirmed. Vorth fleet in system. Recommends you wake up. Variv was awake in 4 minutes. He was looking at the data in 5, the Solari representative, who had been awake anyway in the way that very old beings sometimes are, through simple inability to sleep, was already watching when the Vorth fleet crossed into the outer system. He sat in his private room with a warm drink and the data feed on his screen, and watched in the way he watched most things, with patience, with attention, and without making any immediate conclusions, because he had learned decades ago that immediate conclusions were how experienced people made avoidable errors. He noted the fleet size. He noted the absence of any Earth response. So far, he noted that the Sol system was very quiet on every sensor band, which was either the stillness of a place with nothing to show or the stillness of a place with very good reason to stay hidden. He cleared his throat, was not sure which one it was. He suspected he was about to find out. High Marshal Ketsera was on the bridge of his flagship, the warship Kethavara, when they crossed into the inner system approach. Either Kethavara was a large vessel by Vorth standards, 800 m from bow to stern, bristling with weapons, carrying a crew of over 1,000 by the standards of what was waiting in the asteroid belt. She was a medium-sized rock. Ketsera did not know that. His scan systems were active and running a continuous sweep of the system ahead. The data was coming back clean. 7 frigates in close Earth orbit with their signatures exactly matching what the survey data had shown months earlier. The orbital platform still there, still aging, still presenting the same limited threat profile it always had. The asteroid belt exactly as it appeared. In every map, a field of rocks, cold, quiet, geologically eventful in the slow, grinding way that rock fields are. Eventful over millions of years. No dreadnoughts, no battleships, no hidden fleet. His sensor chief reported that there were some unusual thermal anomalies in the belt. Faint, possibly geological, not consistent with active power systems. The chief recommended logging them for later review. Ketsera acknowledged the report and returned to watching the approach. He was thinking about the human ambassador at the Concord. Her stillness had irritated him slightly when he had reviewed the recording of the forum session. There was a type of stillness that came from shock. A person so overwhelmed they simply stopped responding, frozen by events larger than they could process. There was another type that looked identical from the outside, but came from somewhere very different. He had seen both types in his career. He had told himself he was over-analyzing. It was the habit of a long career to find complexity where there was none. He was 2 hours from the threshold when the transmission arrived. It came on all frequencies, audio, visual, text, in 17 different Concord languages, including Vor Standard and a mathematical sequence at the beginning. That was the galactic convention for a signal intended to be understood by any intelligent receiver. It could not be missed. It could not be dismissed. It was designed to be received by every ship in his fleet simultaneously. Ketsera watched it come up on his screen. He watched the image resolve. A man, human, was sitting behind a plain desk. No dramatic backdrop, no visible weapons, no flags or insignia beyond the collar rank markings of a senior officer. Gray hair, calm face, a coffee cup on the desk beside him, which Ketsera noticed and found in a distant way. Bizarre. The man spoke. He said in Vor Standard. That was accented but entirely correct. That the fleet was now inside a designated human exclusion zone. Oh, he said that their weapons locks, the active targeting systems on the Vorlag ships that had been running since they entered the system, had been detected and logged. He said that the fleet had 1 hour to reverse course and begin withdrawal from the solar system. He said this calmly, without heat, without visible anger, as if he were delivering scheduling information. He said that failure to withdraw in 1 hour would result in the United Earth fleet responding with appropriate and overwhelming force. He gave his name as Admiral Haruto Shen. United Earth Fleet. Then the transmission ended. There was a long silence on the bridge of the Cathar. Cathar looked at the transmission data. He processed it. He looked at his sensor feed, still showing 7 frigates, still showing 1 old platform, still showing a belt full of rocks and faint thermal noise. He thought about the phrase appropriate, an overwhelming force. He did a quick calculation in his head. 200 warships against whatever Earth had. The math was not complicated. He thought about a man who sat behind a plain desk and gave an ultimatum with a coffee cup next to him. He found it funny in a cold way. It was either the bravest thing he had ever seen or the most deluded. He had spent his whole career operating on the principle that there was no real difference between the two until the shooting started. His communications officer opened a return channel. Cathar looked directly at the transmission lens. He said in Common Galactic that he had heard Admiral Shen's message. He said that humanity had a single choice available to it. He said the choice slowly and clearly to make sure there was no translation ambiguity, kneel or burn. Then he closed the channel. On the bridge of the UEFS Indomitable, floating cold and dark in the asteroid belt with her power system shielded and her crew at full readiness, Admiral Shen watched the response transmission end. He sat with it for a moment. Across the Sol system, his fleet was watching. All 14 dreadnoughts and their screening vessels, all the crews who had been waiting, some of them for years on rotating posting, some of them newly arrived from Earth and still adjusting to the scale of what they served on. They were all watching the same feed. They had all heard the same thing, kneel or burn. Shen looked at the screen for another second, then he looked at his communications officer and gave a small nod. She cut the open channel, he said quietly to the room in general. We have been waiting for someone to say that. He picked up his coffee. He drank it. He set it down. Aaron, he said to his tactical officer, bring us up full power all ships. And in the asteroid belt, the Dreadnoughts stopped being rocks. At Arvith Prime, in a monitoring room that had been filling with staff for the last 2 hours, the feeds suddenly went extraordinary. 14 contact signatures appeared in the Sol asteroid belt, each one enormous, each one blazing with the full power output of an active capital ship. They had not been there 1 second before. Now they were. And the room went very quiet. Delegate Borov stared at the data and stopped breathing for a moment. The Solari representative, watching from his private room, set down his drink. He said to the empty room in the voice of someone who had just confirmed a very old suspicion. There it is. Outside, across the whole conquered network, 14 suns had come to life in the dark of the asteroid belt, and the galaxy, for the first time in a very long time, did not know what was going to happen next. To war, when it finally arrived after a long wait, did not feel the way most people imagined it would. There was no single dramatic moment where everything changed. There was instead a series of very fast, very specific decisions made by tired people in loud rooms, and then consequences that moved at the speed of physics and could not be taken back. The 14 dreadnoughts of the United Earth fleet powered up in sequence over the course of 90 seconds. Each one went from cold and dark to fully operational in a bloom of power that the VOR sensor systems had never seen before, because the VOR sensor systems had been calibrated to find things they expected to find, and nobody had expected this. On the bridge of the Kethevara, Ketsara's sensor chief turned from his station with an expression that Ketsara had never seen on the man's face in 15 years of service. The chief was not panicked, he was past panic, went into the specific stillness of someone who was looking at data that does not fit any model in their training. He said there were active contacts in the belt, 14 of them capital class. Ketsara said nothing for a moment. He looked at the contacts himself. He looked at their size. He looked at the power signatures, which were not simply large, they were extraordinary reactor outputs that matched nothing in the conquered shared database of known vessel classes. Then he looked at his fleet spread out across the approach corridor behind him, 200 ships arranged in the standard crescent formation, and he did the new math. 200 against 14 should have been fine, except these were not 14 frigates or 14 cruisers. These were 4 km of metal and weapons, each fully operational and sitting in terrain they knew better than he did. He began to understand that he had been looking at the wrong problem. He called his formation captains. He told them to begin spreading into a wider crescent to cover the belt entry points. He told them to go to weapons, hot, and charge all primary systems. He told his navigator to begin a tactical deceleration so the fleet didn't overrun its own optimal firing range. He was doing all the right things. He was also doing them approximately 37 years too late, and Admiral Shen watched the Voreth formation shift on his tactical display and recognized what Katsura was trying to do. The wider crescent was the correct response to a threat coming from the belt. It would let the Voreth bracket the exit corridors and catch any ship trying to come straight through in a crossfire. It was a good tactical adjustment. Shen had expected it. He had, in fact, counted on it. He told his tactical officer to begin Phase 1. Phase 1 was not the dreadnoughts. Why? Phase 1 was the screen. The smaller vessels of the Earth fleet, 18 ships, between frigate and cruiser class, which had been sitting behind the dreadnoughts. In the belt, they came out of the rocks at speed in 3 separate groups, moving fast toward the outer belt boundary where the Voreth crescent was still forming, their sensors broadcasting loudly and their electronic signatures deliberately exaggerated to look larger than they were. They were not trying to hide how they were trying to be seen. The Voreth captains on the flanks of the crescent did what any sensible captain would do when fast contacts came toward them through broken terrain. They moved to intercept. The crescent tightened on its edges, curving inward, like hands closing around something, which was exactly what Shen wanted. He watched the formation compress. He watched the flanks pull in. He watched the Vorath center, the heaviest part of the crescent. We lose the space it needed to maneuver because its own wings had moved inward. He said, "Iron Corridor, authorization Shen Alpha 7. 2 Dreadnoughts, the UEFS Sovereignty and the UEFS Relentless had not moved from the positions they had been holding in the belt for the last 6 hours. They were deep in the rocks off the main approach vectors, sitting in gaps in the asteroid field that had been identified by Earth survey teams decades earlier for exactly this purpose. When the Vorlag crescent compressed in, the center mass pushed forward into the approach corridor. The Sovereignty and the Relentless were already on both sides of it. They opened fire together. The mass driver rounds moved at a fraction of the speed of light, which was very much faster than anything a crew could see and react to. They were not smart weapons. They were simply very dense, very fast objects, moving in a straight line, or when the physics of very dense, very fast objects hitting other objects was not complicated and was not survivable. The corridor between the two Dreadnoughts became, for 6 minutes, the most lethal stretch of space in the solar system. 41 Vorlag ships were destroyed in those 6 minutes. Some broke apart cleanly under single hits to their power cores. Others took damage that killed their drives and left them spinning, venting atmosphere into vacuum, and in the follow-up rounds found those two. A handful managed partial evasion, rolling and burning hard on emergency thrust. But the Sovereignty's AI targeting system had already calculated evasion corridors and distributed firing solutions among its 6 mass driver banks before the first shot was fired. The Vorlag captains who survived the corridor scattered. Some pushed forward. Most tried to go back or sideways. Hoykut found the screen ships waiting in the rocks with missiles and short-range weapons to deal with vessels trying to maneuver through tight spaces without enough clearance. At Arvith Prime, a monitoring officer said in a very flat voice that 40 contacts in the Vorlag formation had just gone dark. Her supervisor told her to verify the number. She verified it. She said it again. 41, the supervisor reported upward without saying anything else because there was nothing else to say. To Kitsara, a composed man by nature and training, but he felt something he had not felt in decades. The precise and unpleasant sensation of fighting an enemy that was doing what it had planned to do while he was doing what it had planned him to do. Every move his captains made was landing them somewhere that hurt more than they move they had left. The corridor ambush had cost him 41 ships in 6 minutes. His crescent was broken. His flanks were being harassed by the screen ships. Hanawine, who did not engage in sustained fights but instead hit and disappeared back into the rocks and forced his pursuit ships to follow them into terrain where the rocks themselves seemed to be helping the enemy. He pulled his fleet back to a consolidation point outside the belt boundary and tried to assess. He had 152 ships still combat functional against 14. By the original numbers, it was still overwhelming force, but the 14 had not been damaged. None of them had taken any meaningful hits. His own fire had been largely ineffective because the Dreadnoughts barely moved and didn't need to. The point defense networks around each ship had chewed apart his missile salvos so efficiently that most of his rain fire had simply vanished before reaching his target, and the few hits that had gotten through had not done visible damage. He had been in command of fleets for 50 years. He had never seen point defense work like that, or he decided to mass his fire, a single focused volley from 100 ships, all targeting the same vessel. No point defense system in existence could absorb that volume. He picked a target, the UEFS Titan's Wrath, the Dreadnought at the far left end of the Earth formation, which his sensor chief had flagged as having a slightly different power signature from the others, possibly less stable, possibly the weakest link. He ordered every available weapon system to charge. He ordered his captains to designate the Titan's Wrath as primary target, single coordinated salvo on his mark. He gave the mark. The coordinated Voreth salvo was enormous. 100 ships firing simultaneously produced a volume of fire that genuinely did exceed the Titan's Wrath point defense capacity. Energy beams, missiles, kinetic rounds, all of it arrived in a window of 3 seconds, and not all of it was stopped. The Titan's Wrath took 18 direct hits in 3 seconds. There was across every bridge in the Voreth fleet a brief moment of hope. Then the Titan's Wrath came back out of the fire cloud, still moving, still accelerating. Its hull was scorched, sections of its outer armor gone in places, a long scar running from the midship section to the stern where something had carved through the outer layer without reaching what mattered. Its weapons were active, its drives were at 100%. Ketsara stared at the damage report and could not fully process it. 18 direct hits on anything else in any fleet he had ever commanded. That was catastrophic damage. On this ship it was cosmetic. Commander Voss aboard the Titan's Wrath had been thrown against her console restraints by the impacts and was now bleeding from a cut above her eyebrow where something small and metal had clipped her when a secondary panel shorted. She did not notice the blood for several minutes because she was too busy watching her tactical screens, and because the thing she was watching was too interesting to be interrupted by a cut. Ketsara was massing his fleet on the Titan's Wrath, pulling his ships toward her, bringing the whole remaining force to bear on one target, which meant he was pulling them away from their spread positions and compressing them toward her location. She said to her comms officer, "Get me the Admiral." Shen came online immediately. She told him Ketsara was compressing toward her. She gave the coordinates. She said the window was about 4 minutes before they spread again. Shen said he saw it. He said Hephaestus. The Hephaestus array had taken 11 years to build and had never been fired in combat before. It was not a weapon technically, it was an engineering project, a network of mass driver systems built into 43 specific asteroids throughout the belt, when each one positioned and aimed over years of careful work and recalibrated regularly by the teams that quietly maintained them. The asteroids looked like asteroids from the outside. They were asteroids on the outside, but inside each one buried the rock was a machine that could accelerate a very large payload to very high speeds and send it along a very precise vector. 43 mass drivers firing simultaneously, all targeted on the same coordinates. The Vorlag fleet was compressed toward the Titan's Wrath position, clustered more tightly than any fleet should cluster in combat, because Kitsara had been thinking about how to break one ship, not about the geometry of 43 firing solutions. The Hephaestus clears throat array fired once. Later in the mission recordings, the event was logged as lasting approximately 4 seconds from first impact to last. The compressed Vorlag formation occupied a volume of space that 4 seconds was enough to fill thoroughly. 47 ships were destroyed, 11 more were left non-functional, tumbling on altered courses with no power and no response. Of 152 ships that had been at the consolidation point, 62 remained. Kitsara had not been killed. His flagship had been at the edge of the formation, far enough from the compression that it had only been hit by debris and the edges of the barrage. His senior staff were alive. His ship was damaged but mobile. He sat in his command chair in a room where 3 of the screens had gone dark from power rerouting and a fire suppression cloud was still clearing from the engineering section, and he looked at what was left of his fleet. He thought about Earth's ambassador at the Conquered, her stillness, her 4 words. He understood now what kind of stillness it had been. He understood it the way you understand something after the fact, when there is no practical use left for understanding. He had walked 200 ships into the middle of something that had been built specifically to receive him. Every move he had made had been a move they had planned for. The terrain was theirs, the timing was theirs, the weapons were beyond anything he had been told existed. And the fleet that he had been assured did not exist, had been sitting in the rocks for decades, waiting in the dark for exactly this. He opened a channel to his surviving captains. He gave one order: full withdrawal, all ships maximum speed. He did not dress it up. He did not call it a tactical reposition or a strategic reallocation of forces. He called it what it was. He watched his 62 remaining ships burn hard away from the belt, away from the inner system, moving in the ragged way that surviving fleets move when they are no longer organized but simply running. Behind them, the 14 Dreadnoughts did not pursue. They did not need to. They held their positions in the rocks and on the edge of the belt, weapons still active, power signatures still blazing on every sensor band in the system, visible to every monitoring device. The Conquered had pointed at Saul, visible to the whole galaxy. Specialist Ashade was still in the engineering monitoring bay of the UEFS. Indomitable. The battle had passed through her screens as data, power usage readings, damage logs from other vessels, fire control sequences, registering as load spikes on the reactor. She had done her job throughout, tracking and logging and reporting, without being asked to go anywhere or do anything dramatic. When the withdrawal order registered on the fleet-wide tactical feed, not an Earth order but the Voreth one, readable because their communication encryption had been broken 14 months ago by a team at Fort Silas, and nobody had told them. She watched 62 red contact markers begin moving away from Saul at speed. She looked at the display for a long moment, then she leaned back in her chair and breathed out very slowly, in the breath of someone who has been holding tension in their body for many hours without fully knowing it. One of the other engineers across the bay, a man twice her age who had served in the belt contingent for 3 postings and had a reputation for never showing emotion, was looking at the same feed, he said without turning around. That's that then. She said yes, he nodded, then he went back to his readings, surely because the reactor still needed watching and the ship still needed its crew to do their jobs, and the world kept moving even when something enormous happened inside it. Outside in the cold and the dark of the asteroid belt, 14 ships that the galaxy had not known existed sat in the wreckage of the confidence of an empire and waited to be told what came next. 3 weeks after the Battle of Sol, the Galactic Concord convened an emergency session that every delegate the station's history agreed was the most attended, most tense, and most consequential meeting the body had ever held. The outer ring was full, the inner ring was full. The overflow observation galleries, which had been opened 3 times in the Concord's 400-year history, were full. Representatives who had not attended floor session in years were present. Some had traveled for days to be there. Around, everyone wanted to see what happened next. The first order of business was the Vorath Dominion. What remained of Ketzera's fleet had limped back to Vorath space over the course of 10 days, arriving in scattered groups, the larger ships towing the damaged ones that could not manage full drive power on their own. The Dominion's war city of Kethedara had received them in silence. The Concord had received the after-action reports from its monitoring teams in silence, while the galaxy had watched all of this and said very little publicly while saying a great deal privately. High Marshal Ketzera did not appear before the Concord himself. He sent a legal representative, which was his right under Concord procedures. The representative was a Vorath named Tev, well-spoken and composed in the manner of someone who has been handed an extremely difficult assignment and decided the only reasonable response was professionalism. Tev stood at the floor podium and presented the Dominion's official position, which was that the incursion into the solar system had been a legitimate exercise of the protective oversight mechanism provided for under Article 12, that the subsequent military response from Earth had been disproportionate, and that the Vorath Dominion was prepared to discuss a formal ceasefire arrangement with appropriate compensation terms. The hall made a noise. It was not one noise. It was many noises from many species at the same time, which added up to something that was not quite laughter and not quite outrage, but sat in the uncomfortable space between the two. The moderator called for order. Then she recognized Ambassador Yara Oshii. Yara walked to the floor podium from the outer ring, which was a longer walk than most ambassadors made. She had walked it in her mind many times in the weeks since the message she sent to Earth. She had thought about what she was going to say. She had revised it. She had stripped it back. She had decided that the most powerful thing she could bring to this floor was not rhetoric but information, and that the information would speak for itself if she let it. She set a data pad on the podium. She said she had 3 things to present. The first was technical. She walked the room through the legal record of the Article 12 motion that Drex had filed 6 weeks earlier. She showed the timeline. She showed the Vorlag survey of Sol, when it was conducted and when it was shared internally within the Dominion. She showed the gap between when the survey was completed and when the motion was filed, a gap of 4 months during which time the Dominion had been assembling a fleet. She connected these pieces in the plain, unfussy language of a person who does not need to make their evidence more dramatic because it is dramatic enough already. She said that the Article 12 motion had not been a legal question seeking a legal answer. It had been a preparation step for an invasion that was already being planned. When the motion was filed, the fleet did not move because the Concord's legal process was underway. The legal process was initiated to give the fleet's movement cover. The hall was very quiet. The second thing was what she called the observation record. She brought up a series of communications logs. They had been obtained through methods she described only as consistent with Earth's intelligence capabilities, and she said she was not going to discuss those methods because they were not relevant to what the logs contained. What the logs contained was relevant. They were private messages between 3 senior Concord member delegations and the Vorlag ambassador in the months leading up to the fleet's departure. She did not read the messages aloud. She put them on the display screens and let the room read them. The messages did not show the 3 delegations ordering the Vorlag to attack Earth. They did not need to. What they showed was something that anyone who had spent more than a week in diplomatic work would understand immediately. The particular language of people who have been told something is going to happen and have decided not to stop it. Careful non-responses to direct warnings, reassurances that Article 12 was likely to pass. One message from a delegate who clearly had not expected it to ever be read outside a private channel. That said simply, the corridor access is worth more than the human seat. She named the 3 delegations. She named the individuals who had sent the messages. The hall did not go quiet this time. It went into a controlled version of chaos, the kind that happens in formal settings, where people cannot simply start shouting but very much want to. The moderator called for order 3 times. Much she got it on the third thing Yara presented was brief. She said that Earth had concealed its military capacity since the day it joined the Concord as a provisional member. She said this was entirely legal, and it was because the Concord required member worlds to disclose military assets only upon request of the Security Directorate, and no such request had ever been made regarding Earth because no one had considered Earth worth asking. Why she said that Earth had made this choice deliberately, openly documented in the classified records of its own government, and that the reason was simple. Earth had wanted to know who its friends were before it let anyone know what it had. She paused. The hall was very still. She said that it now knew. She picked up her data pad and walked back to the outer ring. What followed was not a quick process. Nothing in the Concord was quick. There were procedural motions and counter motions, Morny requests for investigation, demands for the communications logs to be verified by independent analysts, heated exchanges between delegations on the floor and louder ones in the corridors outside. 3 delegations filed formal protests. 2 of them were the delegations named in Yara's communications record, which did not improve their credibility. Varath representative Tev, to his credit, made no attempt to argue that the logs were fabricated, or he had been given the logs before the session, and he had assessed them for what they were genuine. He sat in his seat and made no further motions. There was nothing further to make. Investigation into the three named delegations was authorized within the week. The findings delivered 6 weeks later confirmed what Yara's logs had shown. One delegation was suspended from the Security Directorate pending review. Another voluntarily reduced its own member status to provisional. An almost unheard of action, but one that avoided a forced reclassification. That would have been more damaging. Third disputed the findings at length and was outvoted at every step. Varath Dominion was formally censured. Under Article 31, the Concord's harshest diplomatic penalty short of expulsion, they were required to withdraw from all systems adjacent to Sol-connected trade lanes. They were fined in a form that translated practically to a significant portion of their economic trade rights. For 5 years, Ketsera was removed from his command by the Dominion's own government, partly in response to the Concord censure, and partly because losing 140 ships in a single engagement against a fleet that wasn't supposed to exist was the kind of result that ended careers everywhere in the galaxy. Earth's provisional membership was terminated, not revoked. It terminated, which meant it had fulfilled its purpose and was being replaced by something permanent. The motion to elevate Earth to full sovereign standing was proposed by the Kaith delegation, which was notable because it was the Kaith who had the most to gain commercially from staying friendly with humanity and had been the most obviously uncomfortable during the weeks before the battle. Delegate Vor had spent those weeks quietly repositioning himself, and he was good enough at his job that the repositioning had worked. He introduced the motion with a prepared speech about the importance of the Concord reflecting the true capabilities of its members, and he looked across the room only once at the outer ring while he delivered it. Yara watched him without expression. The vote for full sovereign standing passed. Earth gained its permanent seat, its full charter rights, and a veto position on the Security Directorate. When the Security Directorate had 6 seats, Earth now held one of them. The signature on the formal elevation document was Yara's. She signed it in the same steady hand she had used to write every document in her career, no different from any other signature she had ever made except in what it meant, and she did not allow herself to sit with what it meant until she was alone in her quarters that evening. Then she sat with it for a long time, in the high orbit above Earth and aboard the UEFS Indomitable. Admiral Shen had been waiting for the diplomatic process to complete before deciding what happened to the fleet. That decision was above his rank, and appropriately so. What to do with 14 dreadnoughts now that the galaxy knew they existed was a political question as much as a military one, and he was glad not to be the one to answer it. While he waited, he ran drills. He reviewed maintenance reports. He walked the corridors of the Indomitable the way he sometimes did when he needed to think, because the ship was large enough that a walk could last a long time, and long walks were good for thinking. He was in the lower observation bay when Ensign Kara Weston found him. She was 23 years old and had been on the Indomitable for 8 months, fresh out of the officer program, but still at the stage of her career where she was collecting experiences and putting them away carefully because she understood they were going to mean more later than she could currently appreciate. She had a question she had been holding. For 3 weeks, she had decided to ask it. She found him standing at the viewport, looking down at Earth, the blue and white and brown of it, what the thing that had been built for and waited for, and was now sitting in the center of a galactic order that was rearranging itself around the surprise of it. She apologized for interrupting. He told her not to. She asked, "What happens now, sir? Now that everyone knows what we have?" He looked at Earth through the viewport. He had thought about this question. He had thought about the galactic politics of revealed capability, about the alliances that would shift shooter, about the species that would want to trade and the ones that would want to negotiate and the ones that would quietly begin programs to try to build something comparable over the next 50 years. He had thought about the responsibility of it and the complexity of it and the years of work that were ahead, because security was never a thing you achieved and then possessed, but a thing you maintained continuously with constant effort. He thought about all of that then he thought about the simplest version of the answer. He said, "Now, they have to be polite." She looked at him. He looked at Earth. He said it without humor, without triumph, without meanness. He said it the way someone says a plain fact, a thing that is simply true and does not require decoration. She thought about it for a moment, then she nodded slowly in the way that young people nod when they receive a piece of information that is going to keep unfolding in their mind for years. She thanked him and left him alone with the view. In the centuries that followed, and there were many centuries because the galaxy kept moving and things changed, and new civilizations emerged and ones faded, and the great slow wheel of history continued to turn. The Battle of Saul was studied in military academies across 47 systems, not only for its tactical elements, which were remarkable enough, but for the decision that preceded it and shaped everything that followed. And a conquered historian named Sarah Vance, who wrote what became the definitive account of the event 300 years after it happened, concluded her work with an observation that was quoted in academic texts and popular histories alike for generations. Afterward, she wrote that the galaxy had looked at Earth and seen a world without weapons. It had seen the one platform in the 7 frigates and the empty belt and the new seat in the outer ring. And it had made the most natural error powerful civilization can make. It had seen what it expected to see instead of what was there. She wrote that this error was understandable. The galaxy had long learned to judge worlds by what they showed, because most worlds showed everything they had, either out of pride or out of deterrence, or simply because the idea of hiding their strength had never occurred to them. Strength was something you displayed. It was currency. You spent it or you lost it. Why she wrote that humanity had understood something different, that a species which had survived its own long and violent history, wars that had lasted centuries, plagues, division, failures that had come close to finishing the whole experiment, had learned a specific and hard-earned truth. The most dangerous position to be in is the one where your enemy knows exactly what you have. And the most powerful moment in any confrontation is not when you reveal your strength. In it is the moment just before, when the enemy has already committed and the strength is still a Surprise. She wrote that the most dangerous species in the known universe was not the one that fought from fear. It was not the one with the biggest fleet or the most advanced weapons, though humanity had both. It was the one that had waited patiently, quietly across decades for a reason worth fighting for, and when that reason came, had answered. On Earth in the years after the battle, most people went about their lives in the ordinary way. They worked, they ate. They argued about things that seemed important and some that did not. They raised children and told stories and disagreed about history and agreed about small things and lived the ordinary, complicated lives that people live everywhere in the universe. When the large events are not happening directly to them, some of them knew in a way, in the way that people know things that are officially classified but culturally understood, that something had changed, that the world their children would grow up in was different from the one they had grown up in, and that the difference was permanent and that it had been earned over a very long time by a very large number of people who had mostly never been famous and never would be. The bastion yards kept building, Fort Silence kept thinking. The Belt contingent kept watching from the dark, and the galaxy for the first time in its long and complicated history learned to knock before it entered.